In May 1925, 3 men mysteriously vanished in the deep Amazon jungles. The team's leader was convinced they were about to uncover one of the world's greatest secret cities. Driven by his desire, nothing could prepare him for the tragedy that eventually befell him and his son on this journey. Obsession, adventure, and tragedy collide in the true story of Percy Fawcett, the British explorer who vanished in the Amazon while searching for the lost city of Zed. What really happened to the English colonel in the deep Amazon jungles? Why has no one come forward with the truth to date? This is the never-heard story of a man's quest which quickly turned into horror and painful losses. For the longest time, explorers and researchers have been fascinated by the idea of long-lost cities and the mystery surrounding them. It's not uncommon to hear of expeditions to discover the true location of Atlantis, Troy, and many others. Sometime in the 1540s, Spanish explorers were the first to write about the possible locations of the Golden City, El Dorado. The result of this writing was a mad rush for the perceived fortunes that the city held. Of course, most of these trips were fatal to the seekers. One of these mysterious cities caught the attention of an English colonel, Percy Fawcett, who spent his life trying to find this lost city. Between 1904 and 1924, he had already embarked on as many as 6 different expeditions across the Amazon jungles. Fascinated by tales of these strange lands, Fawcett was driven to uncover one of the most believable lost cities ever. You see, for cities like Atlantis and El Dorado, the tales of their existence are largely believed in many quarters to have been made up by locals who wanted to fool foreign explorers. However, this city, which Fawcett became intrigued by, is believed to actually exist. He called it the Lost City of Zed. But who was Fawcett, and how did his interest in mysterious civilizations grow? Born on 18th of August 1867, Percy briefly enjoyed the perks of the child of an English aristocrat before his father lost his wealth. Percy was thrust into the harsh reality of a financially deprived society, and in his words, he grew up in an atmosphere lacking affection. This might have contributed to making him the driven, obsessive man he later became. The desire to win at all costs, even when no one believed in him, must have been his philosophy. At 19, he was enlisted in the Royal Artillery as a lieutenant. By 1901, after joining the Royal Geographical Society of London, he was sent to Africa as a surveyor. His job function involved military intelligence gathering. 5 years later, he was sent on another expedition to the Amazon by the Society. This assignment redefined his life. As soon as Percy stepped on South American soil, he became a different man. For some reason, he perceived he was standing on the grounds of his destiny. Although his initial assignment was to map out certain territories along the Bolivian-Brazilian borders, he knew he would be doing more than this in the coming years. However, Percy often encountered resistance from the locals. As far as they knew, Percy and his team had come to exploit their rubber plantations just like the other foreigners who visited earlier on. For almost 10 years, he continued to map out these areas even as he studied the peculiar life of the locals. At the break of the First World War, Fawcett's exploration was interrupted. He was forced to return to England and participate in the war. Thankfully, he survived and returned to what he always loved. In 1912, Fawcett came across a strange document called Manuscript 512. This ancient document is believed to have been written by Portuguese settlers known as Bandeirantes in South America. These Portuguese travelers set out on a mission to capture and subjugate the indigenous Brazilians while extending their colony. Eventually, they turned their attention to discovering precious metals like gold, silver, and diamond mines. During one of such expeditions in the Amazonian jungles, one of the Bandeirantes, João da Silva Gumires, came across the huge ruins of a city. It had rubles from what looked like a temple with columns and arches that suggested that a civilization once thrived here. He's believed to have written the Manuscript 512 document sometime in 1753. He described in great detail the city and, most likely, the things that could be found there. He also referred to it as a large occult area with no known form of human habitation at the time of writing. Fawcett found and read this carefully preserved manuscript in a Brazilian museum, and it inspired him in no little way. Was this document genuine? There are two schools of thought. One believes it was a forgery written by someone with an overactive imagination. It's believed that this phony document was likely written by indigenous Brazilians sometime after their independence in 1825 as a way to portray their newly independent nation as a strong and wealthy country. However, others believe it's an authentic document. One such believer was Richard Francis Burton, a legendary explorer and writer. Fawcett was particularly intrigued by the document. He was convinced that there were indeed, quote, very large settlements, as well as also, quote, fine roadways in the interior, as stated in the mysterious manuscript. With the war now over, Fawcett was determined to uncover this long-hidden city. And another gift from his friends will deepen his conviction to embark on this mission. Apart from the manuscript, Fawcett also came across an ancient token given to him by the famous English writer, Sir Rider Haggard. Haggard, famous for some of his literary works like King Solomon Mines, She, and other great works, was a good friend of Fawcett. This token he gave him was known as the Basalt Idol and was believed to have existed in one of the ancient civilizations of mankind. Most likely the Incas or some other unknown time of human existence. It was also believed to have mysterious powers. Upon receiving this from the writer, Fawcett took it to the museum, but no one could place the timeline it belonged to. Driven by this mystery, Fawcett was convinced he was holding onto an ancient puzzle piece that could guide him on his next expedition. Although Manuscript 512 describes a city lying somewhere in the northeastern part of Brazil, Fawcett was convinced that the city of Zed lay somewhere deep in the central western region of Mato Grosso. With this conviction, he begins to plan his next trip to the heart of the Amazon jungle. As far as he knew, there were buried cities in the jungle, and with some luck, he could reach them. Fawcett had risen to fame following his previous mapping expedition to the Bolivian-Brazilian borders. Although these assignments appeared to be scientific, they were dangerous adventures. The reports from these missions included fighting off bloodthirsty bugs, escaping poisoned arrows from local Indians who hated the exploitative foreigners, and other dangers. As a result, Fawcett became an icon to his countrymen. He had become the definition of strength and courage, and the conqueror of the dreaded Amazon jungles. These were the accolades that the middle-aged man had received over time. Despite these celebrations, he wanted more. 8 years ago in 1912, an American explorer and politician, Hiram Bingham, discovered and excavated Machu Picchu. This ancient find was enough to spur the Englishman to start planning his next and biggest expedition to the city of Zed. Machu Picchu, just like City Zed, was also believed to not have existed. Learned colleagues and explorers called Hiram mad for thinking there would be an ancient, sophisticated civilization that was in the Amazon, but it was discovered and proved doubters wrong. The discovery of Machu Picchu was one of the greatest artistic, architectural, and land use achievements anywhere, and the most significant tangible legacy of the Inca civilization. This made Fawcett think, if this enormous civilization was found, what's to say City Z doesn't exist? There was only one way to find out. As the preparation for the trip began in 1920, Fawcett described in some letters to his son Brian what he expected to find. He believed that Zed was located in some valley and that the city emitted a strange, fearful light, so terrifying that the locals dreaded it. Of course, these descriptions were considered foolish by some other explorers. However, Fawcett believed they were only trying to ridicule him since they were too scared to embark on such trips themselves. He planned to get to Mato Grosso, a deep-seated part of the Amazon jungle. Like his previous trips, he would travel light and make up for whatever provisions they needed on the way by befriending the locals and eating what they served them. However, this way of preparing may have been one of the reasons why he eventually met his sad fate. Fawcett's plans were sketchy, to say the least. He kept all the details secret, as he didn't want anyone to discover the city before him. By September 1920, he set out with some men from a place known as Cuyaba. However, the trip proved to be more difficult than he imagined. It was only a matter of time before the first dog died, followed by a horse. These deaths would continue, with many of his men suffering fatigue and despair. Sadly, after 6 weeks, one of the men had returned for obvious reasons of exhaustion. The trip was unbearable. They also lost their provisions and horses faster than they imagined. At some point, Fawcett is overtaken by a strange fever and becomes delirious. The mission had failed to go as planned. Without any strong animals to continue, he is forced to shoot their last sick horse, thus ending this expedition and returning home. He eventually called this place Dead Horse Camp. The trip ended up draining him financially and even physically, as he was said to have lost over 55 pounds during the journey. After this failed expedition, Fawcett returns to re-strategize. However, because his first expedition went bad, no one was willing to sponsor this new adventure. Even the Royal Geographical Society declined his mission this time. Many people also believed this was an unnecessary trip, but Fawcett, who was about 57 years old at the time, was convinced he was on the right track. At his age, he felt the people who once celebrated his achievements were beginning to despise him as a mere treasure hunter. After about 3 years of persuading likely sponsors, he finally found a willing institution known as the Glove, quote-unquote, to sponsor his trip. It was a group of London-based financiers. He also had some support from the North American Newspaper Alliance. When the news of his second trip to Zed broke, some volunteers opted to join him. One of these men was none other than the famous Thomas Edward Lawrence, popularly known as Lawrence of Arabia, the distinguished English soldier, diplomat, and archaeologist. Of course, Fawcett declined his services. He was on a budget, and going with someone like Lawrence was an expense he didn't want to bear. Instead, he decided to go with 2 younger men who he believed would be better suited for the rough terrains of the jungle. He took his son, Jack Fawcett, and his son's friend, Rayleigh Rimmel. The 2 men were young and strong, but inexperienced, as they'd never traveled into the Amazon jungles. So, about 5 years after his first failed trip, Fawcett set out again with the 2 men and 2 Brazilian volunteers in April 1925. Armed with sketchy details, hidden clues, and luck, the men made their journey. It's important to state here that Fawcett was secretive about this trip. I reckon the reason he called the city Zed was to throw potential explorers off their trail. I'm also convinced he was driven by competition and the need to outdo people like Hiram Bingham and American explorer Alexander Hamilton Rice, who he feared would get to Zed before him. Anyway, the plan was to travel through the rivers of the jungle and uncover the city of Zed before finishing off the journey in Salvador. The first few days of the journey were easy to navigate. They encountered trimmed grasses as they marched on. They also covered about 7 miles, although the younger men struggled to match the pace of Fawcett. By the next day, they covered another 10 miles. At some point, the 2 young men were trailing so far behind that Fawcett rode off without them. He only returned the following morning to them after they spent the night alone. Sadly, Rayleigh was severely bitten by ticks, leaving him with an infected foot. Without adequate medical care, it was only a matter of time before the infection worsened. As a result, the team was forced to stay with an old friend of Fawcett, Hermenegildo Galvo, in his ranch guarded by fierce-looking gunmen. After several days, they left and made their way to Bakairi. After a month, on 15th of May 1925, they had gotten to the Bakairi post, which had a military installation. However, this milestone was achieved with mixed joy. The journey, just like the first trip in 1920, was filled with lots of difficulties, but the more worrisome was Rayleigh's foot, which wasn't healing up. By May 29th, as they approached Dead Horse Camp, the Brazilian volunteers who went with him had become scared of the territory they were about to enter. In any case, Fawcett didn't want their company anymore, so he sent them back. He also asked Rayleigh to go with the men, but the young man did not want to leave his friend, Jack. In the end, Fawcett agreed to allow him to stay on the trip. In Fawcett's final letter to his wife, he described their journey. He also told her they were about to enter uncharted territories, the region beyond the Xingu rivers. This meant no one would be able to contact them for a couple of years if they survived. These letters were usually delivered by Indian runners who ran from whatever hidden part of civilization they lived to wherever the letter needed to get to. 18 months later, Fawcett was unreachable, and no one could say where he was. By January 1927, the Royal Geographical Society officially declared him missing, and search parties were put together to find him, or at least his remains. It became a spectacle and viral news in England, so much so that it is said to be the inspiration for Indiana Jones. However, there was a problem locating him or his team. It turns out that in some of his final correspondences, he had provided conflicting coordinates, making it difficult to track him. Some people believe he must have made a mistake, but others believe he intentionally did this. The reason for this was he didn't want any search parties to look for him, or for anyone else to steal his discovery. In any case, some people still tried to find the missing team. One such person was George Miller Dyott, an aviator who set out to find Fawcett in 1928. Although his journey was unsuccessful, he found clues as to where Fawcett had likely been. In the Nahakwa village, Dyott found local Indians with some of the missing man's items. Things like a metal case and a tag were found here. Dyott's appeal to have some natives accompany him was equally unsuccessful. It appeared the locals were scared or unwilling to travel with foreigners into the jungle. Dyott's account with the locals is quite intriguing. When he approached the village chief to offer him some men to find Fawcett, a mild drama occurred. The chief suddenly shrieked the word, "Suyas!" He then proceeded to slap his open fist on the back of his head a number of times before collapsing to the ground. All of this was his way of informing Dyott that Fawcett had been killed by violent natives. The Suyas were a fierce, warlike Indian tribe. They usually received their visitors without any form of malice. However, when the visitors least expected it, they struck them from behind across the neck. Most times this was a fatal strike. Dyott is, however, unsure if the chief's account is authentic or if he was trying to make the rival Indian group look bad. If this wasn't the case, he was probably unwilling to venture into hostile territories. Unfortunately, he never found Fawcett, his son, or Rayleigh. As far as everyone was concerned, the trio was no more. They'd been killed by locals during their expedition. Although Dyott's account appears compelling, the discovery of more pieces of evidence revealed otherwise. You see, Fawcett's son, Brian, stated that the items found with the chief were part of the items his father carried in his previous expedition in 1920. This means the chief's account couldn't be relied upon. He was probably trying to malign the other tribes. By 1932, the story of the local chief had lost more credibility because another Swiss hunter, Stephen Ratton, claimed he'd met Fawcett at some point. Ratton claims he was once invited by a local chief during one of his travels. While there, he came across an elderly-looking white man who he believes is Fawcett. The old man, upon realizing that Ratton was from Europe and could speak English, asked for help to get away from the locals who had apparently captured him. He also asked him to get in touch with an official at the English consulate in Brazil. But was this really Fawcett held captive by locals? The answer is no. You see, Ratton's description of the man he saw didn't meet those of Fawcett. Moreover, the official he spoke about had long left Brazil. So what happened to Fawcett and his team? There are lots of speculations about how they ended. These theories go from wild to outright treacherous. By the 1950s, some Brazilian brothers attempted to find and possibly rescue Fawcett. They were known as the Boas Villa brothers, and their names were Orlando, Claudio, and Leonardo. Like, no joke. Orlando believes that a terrible fate befell Fawcett. Because of the Villa brothers' activism and desire to see indigenous tribes protected, many tribes befriended them. It's during an interaction with one of these tribes, the Kalapalo, that he heard what really happened to Fawcett. The locals told him that Fawcett had been murdered for many reasons, one of which was his selfish nature. I mentioned earlier that Fawcett chose to travel light, hoping to make up whatever deficiencies they had from the locals they encountered on the way. Well, it turns out that most explorers before him usually presented gifts to the host communities they met. Metalware and other incentives were given to the locals whenever they visited. Fawcett, however, appeared mostly empty-handed. At some point, it is believed that Fawcett and his team took a boat on their trip. They might have exchanged some of their items for this boat. On their way to the Kalapalo tribe, they probably lost most of their gift items for the Indian host. This is why they likely arrived without gifts. As though this wasn't bad enough, the foreigners behaved quite rudely. For instance, it's believed that one of them once urinated in a river that the Indians drank from. This action provoked their hosts. However, the natives likely forgave this action, attributing it to ignorance on the offender's part. In the days that followed, one of the men on Fawcett's team went hunting and killed a small animal for meat. When he got to their camp, he hung it up to dry and to keep it away from ants. An Indian passing by saw the animal and came forward to get a piece of the meat, but he was prevented from doing so. You might be tempted to ask why the Indian would boldly approach the foreigners for a piece of what they captured when he didn't participate in the hunt. You see, the Kalapalo people are really generous and believe food should be shared. The refusal of their foreign visitors to share some of the catch with them was considered offensive. However, this was only a build-up to the straw that finally broke the camel's back. One day, a little child came close to Fawcett and his men. He was immediately fascinated by some of their tools and gadgets and began to play with them. One of the men, probably Fawcett, drove the child away, but the little lad wouldn't leave and returned to continue playing. After some time, one of the men, irritated by the little one's boldness, struck the child. This act of hitting a child is considered unpardonable by the locals, as they never hit their children. This might have contributed to their decision to take the life of the explorers. Shortly after this, the locals allowed them to set out on their journey, but later ambushed and killed them. The two younger men, Jack and Rayleigh, were tossed into the river, while Fawcett was buried. Was this true? Not exactly. When Orlando requested for the remains of Fawcett, a grave was exhumed and the skeletal remains were sent to London to confirm the identity of the remains. However, the skeleton didn't belong to Fawcett. In the end, no one could give an accurate picture of what actually happened to Fawcett. This led me to look up other logical theories. One of such theories was put forward by an old-time acquaintance of the missing geographer, Henry Costain. Henry, being familiar with the treacherous jungle, believes Fawcett was indeed killed, but not by the natives. Instead, he thinks the team died from exhaustion and starvation. From his personal experience, traveling through the Amazon forest is extremely difficult. He's certain the team may have succumbed to extreme exhaustion or starvation after a while. And remember, Fawcett usually traveled light, so Henry's theory has lots of credibility. He had traveled with Fawcett on some previous expeditions. He knew how difficult covering as little as a mile in the hot and insect-filled jungle was. He also knew about Fawcett's stringent travel plans. All of this put together may have affected them. Remember also that Rayleigh had now become a burden to them because of his foot infection. Carrying on in the jungle with someone who needed the daily support of his companions was a disaster waiting to happen. It was only a matter of time before they ran out of supplies, since they moved slower than expected and spent their limited resources faster. From all indications, this was a doomed mission from the very beginning. After all that, and in the end, Fawcett's story remains a mystery. And here's the crazy part. LiDAR scans and further explorations of the northeastern parts of Mato Grosso in recent times have uncovered remains of actual cities that once thrived, which in a way corroborated the claims made by Fawcett. He wasn't just a madman obsessed, it was looking like he was right. Though no one knows the true location of Zed. But finding these remains of actual cities proved that City Zed might have existed. Heck, who knows? Maybe what was found was actually City Zed. Unfortunately, Fawcett isn't here to tell us if it's true or false.